Few criminal cases in America have captivated the public's attention quite like the disappearance of Caylee Marie Anthony, a bright-eyed 2-year-old girl from Orlando, Florida. When her mother, Casey Marie Anthony, was acquitted of her murder in 2011, the verdict just sent shock waves through the country, multiple countries. I was in Canada like, what? The trial was a media spectacle, a courtroom drama filled with unexpected twists, unreliable testimony, and a mother whose behavior baffled even the most experienced detectives. Casey Anthony's story is one of contradictions, lies, and controversy. She was painted by prosecutors as a selfish, reckless young woman who murdered her child to live a carefree, party-filled life. And that's what most of the public thinks as well. The defense, however, cast her as a victim of lifelong sorrow, a young mother who panicked after her daughter's accidental death and was forced to cover it up by her domineering father. So in this video, we're going to delve into every single significant detail of this case, beginning with Casey's unfortunate birth. Up to Caylee's extremely unfortunate disappearance and the grueling 6-month search for the child in the trial that divided the nation. And finally, we will explore Casey Anthony's attempts to rebrand herself in recent weeks, and she's trying to do so on TikTok. But anyway, crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I love to consume. And I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful-minded, intellectually minded freak. I said minded to times, but that's okay cause you got a big one. But we're doing just that. We're going from beginning to whatever the hell is happening now on TikTok in Casey Anthony's life. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this extremely controversial case together. You know I gotta put my glasses on. I can't read. Okay, wow, it's crazy how these work really well. So to understand Casey Anthony, one must first examine the family that raised her. Born on March 19th, 1996 in Warren, Ohio, Casey was a daughter to George and Cindy Anthony, assuming average American couple who also had a son and older brother to Casey whose name is Lee. And George, Casey's father, was a former police officer turned security guard, and Cindy, her mother, was a nurse. And by all appearances, the Anthonys lived a stable middle-class life. But behind closed doors, cracks in the family structure were already forming. And according to various accounts, Casey had a very troubled relationship with the truth from an early age. She was a pathological liar, which will come into play throughout this entire case. So by high school, she had perfected the art of deception. In 2000, her parents proudly planned to attend her graduation, only to discover that she was short on credits and had been lying about graduating for months. If I told my parents that I was graduating and then they found out I just lied about it, I would be disowned entirely. So that was just the first big lie in Casey's life. And then from 2000 to 2006, she would end up getting a job at Universal working for event imaging solutions at Kodak. But this was a job again that she only had for 2 years, which is relevant. And later that same year, Casey revealed something even more shocking, but also something she would deny vehemently, and that is that she was pregnant at the age of 19. So far we have her lying about graduating and then lying about being pregnant until she just basically couldn't lie about it anymore. So it's not looking good. And even to this day, Casey Anthony's paternity remains a mystery. Different men were suggested as the father, including her then fiancé Jesse Grundon, a deceased young man named Jesus Ortiz. However, none of these claims have ever been proven. And on August 9th of 2005, Casey would give birth to Caylee Marie Anthony, a beautiful baby girl with big brown eyes and a very playful spirit. And despite initial happiness, tensions quickly arose in Cindy Anthony, Casey's mother, who wanted Casey to actually give Caylee up for adoption, instead became Caylee's primary caregiver because Casey had said multiple times while being pregnant that she wanted to give her Caylee up for adoption, that she didn't want this kid altogether, which again plays a lot into the story to come. So Casey's role in her daughter's life just grew increasingly distant. So that was in 2005, and then between 2005 and 2007, Casey would have a lot of relationships. She would date Jesse Grund, she would date Ricardo Morales and Tony Lazaro. She would get engaged to Jesse and then break the engagement in 2006. And then in 2007, Kaylee allegedly had a miscarriage from a relationship with Brandon Snow, so she was bebopping all over the place. But by 2007, Kaylee was leading a double life. She told her parents that she still had a job at Universal Studios. Newsflash, she fucking didn't. She lied. She had actually just been unemployed for years. So when she left the house, she just wasn't working. She was just partying it up and stealing money from her parents, just a pluses all around, about $4,500 to be exact. And her parents, of which were already really struggling and having financial issues themselves, not to mention looking after her daughter Caylee on a regular basis. But everything would really start to unravel in June of 2008. So jumping back a few months, in April of 2008, Cindy, Kaylee's mother, was actually considering kicking Kaylee out of the house after discussing her behavior with a counselor because she's a pathological liar, as we know, and her parents were just done with it. And then in May of 2008, Kaylee would actually start looking for her own house with a friend, Amy, who was Ang A, and that's what brings us to June 2008, which are the last days in which Caylee was with us. So on June 9, 2008, Kaylee and Caylee would stay at Ricardo's house, which was a guy that Kaylee was seeing at the time. And then the next day, Ricardo would see Caylee for the last time. And they would actually leave Ricardo's house, and Ricardo would go on to say that Kaylee would give Caylee drugs in order to make her sleepy or drowsy. And he had a lot of not great things to say about her in terms of mothering, but we will get to that. And whether they were actually dating at that time or if they were just friends, I don't really know because she was bebopping around as we know. But the next day, Kaylee would change her relationship status to in a relationship with Tony Lazzaro. And then the next day, Kaylee would tell her friends that she would actually be moving out soon. And Kaylee would also tell her friend Amy that she actually can't go to Jacksonville because her dad had a mini stroke, which was a lie, of course. And then a couple days after that, on June 15th, Cindy and Caylee would visit Cindy's father for Father's Day. And this would be the last confirmed sighting of Caylee. So Caylee visited her great-grandfather at a nursing home with Cindy Anthony, her grandma. And then Cindy would end up taking the last known photograph of Caylee there as well. And then Caylee and Cindy would return home back to the Anthony's house and swim in the pool in the backyard. And then Kaylee would spend the day with her boyfriend Tony Lazzaro, which brings us to June 16th, the day Caylee went missing. So at 12:50 p.m. Kaylee would leave her parents' house with Caylee as seen by George Anthony. And unfortunately, he would never see his granddaughter again. And then around 4 p.m. that same day, Kaylee's phone records show she remained in the area for hours after leaving. And then a few hours later at 7:54 p.m. Kaylee is seen at a Blockbuster video store with Tony Lazzaro. Caylee is nowhere to be seen. And then the next day on June 17, 2008, Kaylee stays at Tony's apartment for most of the day. And from 2:45 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Kaylee is at her parents' house with her car backed into the garage. And she would actually borrow a shovel from her neighbor Brian Berner. And Kaylee would just tell her mother Cindy that Caylee was just with her babysitters and NY. And an NY is somebody she has brought up before as her babysitter. And then on June 18th, which was the next day, Kaylee again would back her car into the garage at her parents' house. She would borrow the shovel from Brian Berner for about an hour, but she would tell Cindy, her mother, that she was at a conference in Tampa. And Kaylee Anthony informed her mother that she was going on a work trip to Busch Gardens theme park in Tampa, Florida. And she claimed that she would be bringing Caylee along with an NY watching her while she attended the meetings. All while Tony Lazzaro confirms Caylee was never at his apartment. Hopefully this is making sense. So during the supposed 6-day trips, Indy Anthony received no contact from Kaylee despite leaving multiple voicemail messages. And when Kaylee finally returned her, all she told Cindy that an NY had been in a very serious car accident, leaving them stuck in the hospital, which prevented her and Caylee from coming home. So, just excuses. Do you remember the shovel? And then excuses. And then we come to the next day, June 19th, where George Anthony reported the theft of multiple gas cans from his shed to the Orange County Sheriff's Office. And later, Cindy Anthony mentioned the incident to Kaylee over the phone. And in response, Kaylee claimed that she had returned to Orlando that same afternoon to retrieve insurance information uncoordinate with an NY's family regarding her hospitalization. Excuse us, excuse us, excuse us. And she also stated that she briefly stopped at her home to get some belongings before heading back to Tampa, uncertain of when she would return. And then during this conversation, Kaylee admitted to stealing the gas cans herself. And then Kaylee would go back to Tony's apartment and look for other apartments with him, which brings us to the next day, June 20th, where Cindy and Tony continues pressing Kaylee about Kaylee's whereabouts. And Kaylee would claim she's still at the conference in Tampa when she wasn't tapped. And that night, Kaylee would enter a hard body contest at Fusion nightclub class act. So while her daughter is missing currently, as far as we know, she's just out in a hot body contest. It's literally impossible for me to be unbiased in this. I'm just not gonna be alright anyway. That brings us to June 21st to June 22nd, which was a weekend where Kaylee would just continue claiming that she was in Tampa. And she would tell friends that Caylee is at the beach. And Cindy would obviously continue to berate Kaylee about where the Caylee is her granddaughter. And then on June 23rd, Kaylee would run out of gas and break into her parents' shed again with Tony and steal their gas cans. And Cindy would obviously still insist on seeing Caylee, but Kaylee claims her babysitter was in the car accident and Kaylee's with her and she just doesn't know where she is. Yada yada, excuses, excuses, excuses. And then the next day, George Anthony would notice a lock on a shed is broken and he would report it to police. But then Kaylee would arrive home and aggressively hand George the stolen gas cans, just cursing him out. And then the next day, on June 25th, 2008, Kaylee would tell her friend Amy that her car smells like something died in it. So then the next day, on June 27th, Kaylee would abandon her white Pontiac Sunfire at an Amscott parking lot near a dumpster. And she would call Tony Lazzaro to come pick her up, and then she would proceed to go to a nightclub later that night. And then a few days later, on June 30th, Kaylee's car would be towed from Amscott to Johnson's Wrecker. And Cindy Anthony is on vacation and would keep on insisting on seeing Caylee. She just was constantly asking Kaylee, where is Caylee, where is Caylee? And Kaylee would just keep on making excuses, And then on July 1st, my birthday, Kaylee would stay at her ex-fiance's Jesse Grun's apartment. And she would tell her mother that Caylee is now with a woman named Jennifer Rosa. And a couple days later, Cindy would drive to Universal Studios to find Caylee, but is told by Kaylee that they are in Jacksonville now. And Cindy would then create a MySpace post titled "My Caylee is Missing." And the post is just heartbreaking. Obviously, we'll put it on screen so you can read it. But it's just her saying how much she misses Caylee, how much she's Caylee, how much she's helped Kaylee, and she just wants to know where she is. It's just like gut-wrenching. And then on July 4th, the day after Cindy made that post, Kaylee would party at Lake Elah and watch fireworks with her friends. And Cindy Anthony would anticipate that Kaylee would return home after the 4th of July weekend. However, Kaylee claimed that cart rubbles during an out-of-town trip left her stranded in Jacksonville, Florida, preventing her from coming home. And she said she will remain in Jacksonville until July 14th, which was 10 days after obviously the 4th. And then the next day, Kaylee would claim that she would actually return on July 12th because her car broke down in Jacksonville. Or Kaylee would go clubbing again from the 10th to the 12th on the weekend at a Fusion again. But on July 15th, George and Cindy would actually retrieve Kaylee's abandoned car from the tow yard. And George and Tony actually received a letter that placed Tony's vehicle in an Orlando tow yard, not in Jacksonville at all. So they figured it out. She lied again cause that's what she does. And then Cindy Anthony, who then tried calling and texting Kaylee Anthony regarding a major problem that she needed to discuss with her immediately. And then Cindy and George retrieved the car and they noticed that the trunk smelled of decomposition. So Cindy Anthony would call 911 multiple times, growing increasingly concerned. And Cindy Anthony decided to contact Kaylee's friend Amy to inquire about Kaylee and Caylee and what the actual is going on. And Amy confirmed that Kaylee was not in Jacksonville as she claimed, but was instead staying at her boyfriend Lazzaro's apartment in Orlando. So Cindy Anthony drove to Lazzaro's apartment, where she confronted Kaylee and demanded to see Caylee, her granddaughter and Kaylee's daughter. And Kaylee reluctantly agreed and the two set off in the car, but she refused to reveal her destination. So she was just aimlessly driving Cindy around, basically not just trying to figure out another while she could puke out of her ugly mug. So frustrated and alarmed, Cindy Anthony called the police on her daughter while they were on the drive-thru. And Casey would tell her family Caylee was kidnapped. Now, that's the lie she came up with. That's what it is. Zanny the Nanny kidnapped Caylee. And she claimed she dropped Caylee off at the Sagres apartments, but police would look into this and figure out that Zanny the Nanny never existed. Well, she kind of did, cause in 2011 the Reals and Ada Fernandez Gonzalez's lawyer, John Morgan, told ABC News that Anthony came up with the fake nanny's name after. Both her and Ada visited the same Florida apartment complex on the same day. And after she looked at the apartments, Ada filled out an information card that included the names of two of her daughters and the type of cars that they drove. And the information on the card matched what Anthony later told police when accusing the nanny of being responsible for Caylee's disappearance. So it was literally just this one day where she met this random woman and then had her information and decided to make her look guilty of stealing her daughter. She was just a weird random scapegoat. But at last, Casey confessed that Caylee had been missing at this point for 31 days. And she claimed, like I said before, that Zanny the Nanny had taken her as a punishment for being a bad mother, which you are, but insisted that she had spoken to Caylee on the phone that very day on July 15th. So she wasn't that worried. And when the 911 operator asked why she waited so long to report her daughter missing, Casey responded, "I've been looking for her and have gone through other resources to try to find her, which was stupid." Yeah, and also Casey wasn't the one that reached out to the police. It was Cindy, her mom, and she was just forced to, basically. So Cindy Anthony reported that Caylee was missing, stating that she hasn't seen her granddaughter for 31 days and noting a very strong odor in Casey's car that she describes as smelling like there's been a dead body in the damn car. But the 911 call is crazy, so give it a listen. 911, what's your emergency? I called a little bit ago, the deputy sheriff. I found out my granddaughter has been taken. She has been missing for a month. We're talking about a 3-year-old little girl. My daughter finally admitted that the babysitter stole her. I need to find her. Your daughter admitted that you're the baby as well. The babysitter took her months ago. My daughter said, but she's been trying to find her herself. There's something wrong. I found my daughter's car today and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car. Okay, what is the 3-year-old's name? Caylee. Caylee Anthony. Caylee Anthony, yes. How long has she been missing for? I have not seen hers since the 7th of June. And the 911 call is just like you can hear Cindy, Caylee's grandmother, just beside herself, like so worried. It gives me chills, but she's like obviously distraught. And then you hear the juxtaposition of Casey when she gets on the phone and she's just like annoyed. She's like, yeah, like my daughter's been missing or whatever, like it's so frustrating. Is your daughter there? Yes? Can I speak with her? Can you tell me what's going on? Hello? Yes, can you tell me what's going on a little bit? I'm sorry, can you tell me a little bit what's going on? My daughter's been missing for the last 31 days. And you know who is her? I know who is her. I've tried to contact her. I actually received a phone call today now from a number that is no longer in service. I did get to speak to my daughter for about a minute. Who is hers? Do you have a name? Her name is Ada Fernandez Gonzalez. Who is that? Babysitter. She's been my nanny for about 1.5 years, almost 2 years. Why are you calling now? Why didn't you call 31 days ago? I've been looking for her and have gone through other resources to try to find her. Which is so the next day, the police would obviously get involved and cadaver dogs would alert to decomposition in Casey's car in the Anthony backyard. And Casey would be arrested after providing false information to investigators, including the fabricated story of Zanny the Nanny kidnapping Caylee. And then the next day, forensics tests would confirm that there was a decomposed body in Casey's trunk at some point. And a few days later, at a bond hearing, Casey's declared a person of interest, and the hearing introduced evidence that a cadaver dog had detected the odor of human decomposition in the cart trunk in Anthony's backyard. And then on July 5th, 2011, 7 women and 5 men prepared to hand the verdict to the bailiff. And Anthony, then 25, was breathing very heavily, unblinking back tears, putting on the performance of a century. And by most accounts, the woman, dubbed the most hated woman in America, was facing a lengthy prison sentence, and the death penalty was still on the table. And then the court clerk began reading the verdict in the hushed courtroom, and jaws dropped as Anthony was acquitted of all serious charges against Harges. As to the charge of first-degree murder verdict, as to count 1, we the jury find the defendant not guilty. As to the charge of aggravated child abuse verdict, as to count 2, we the jury find the defendant not guilty. As to the charge of aggravated manslaughter of a child verdict, as to count 3, we the jury find the defendant not guilty. As to the charge of providing false information to a law enforcement officer verdict, as to count 4, we the jury find the defendant guilty of providing false information to a law enforcement officer as charged in the indictment. As to the charge of providing false information to a law enforcement officer verdict, as to count 5, we the jury find the defendant guilty of providing false information to a law enforcement officer as charged in the indictment. As to the charge of providing false information to a law enforcement officer verdict, as to count 6, we the jury find the defendant guilty of providing false information to a law enforcement officer as charged in the indictment. As to the charge of providing false information to a law enforcement officer verdict, as to count 7, we the jury find the defendant guilty of providing false information to a law enforcement officer as charged in the indictment. She was only convicted of 4 counts of providing false information to police, and he would send Casey to consecutively 1 year in county jail and $1,000 in fines each of the 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement officers, which was the maximum penalty prescribed by the law. So for $1,000 basically. But because Casey had been incarcerated since October of 2008, she received more than 1,000 days in time served credit, and she was released 10 days after, sentencing on July 17th. Less than 2 weeks later, she would just walk free from jail. And the public would just be unanimously outraged. The judicial system failed, and I'm not gonna say it didn't. Allegedly thinks she did it, allegedly. It seems as though, based off the evidence, I think she may have done it, but that's only alleged, And time has gone on. She kind of went into hiding after this whole thing, obviously facing a lot of public scrutiny. And then in March 2017, in her first public interviews since the trial, Casey gave a series of interviews to the Associated Press about her case. And in these interviews, she discussed her acquittal, the death of her daughter Caylee, and her life since the case. I'm still not even certain as I stand here today about what happened. I don't to your understanding, how did she die? I don't know. You don't know. Something about drowning, possibly. Everyone else has their theories. I don't know. So your parents had her. My dad did. And next thing you know, she's missing. I'm right. How did it place? I did what I was told. I don't remember too much of what. And she would basically just go over and say she doesn't know how Caylee's last hours unfolded. She understands why people have opinions about her. Good bitch. And she still dreads the supermarket checkout line. You should bet. And she's happy and enjoys investigative work, and she doesn't care what others think of her. She's okay with herself and sleeps well at night knowing that her daughter died, that she doesn't know why, but she still sleeps very soundly at night, not knowing how or why her daughter died. Which is awesome to know. I don't give a shit about what anybody thinks about me. I don't care about that, yeah. I never will. I'm okay with myself. I sleep pretty good at night. And she had to endure what she was accused of. That's basically what she said in those interviews. I'm so just bullshit, basically. And there's been multiple TV series, documentaries since. There's Prosecuting Casey Anthony, Where the Truth Lies, Casey Anthony, An American Murder Mystery, The Case of Caylee Anthony, Casey Anthony's Parents, Casey Anthony, How Did We Get Here? She was on the first 48. She's on KallMeKris's YouTube channel. Congrats, you okay? I'm bringing you back into the spotlight. And it's bitch okay. And that brings me into what we're really talking about today, and it's her big comeback. It's the utter audacity of this waste of oxygen coming onto a happy platform, and that is TIKTOK. Kaylee Anthony, America's most hated mother, has launched a TikTok a newsletter to reintroduce herself personally and professionally as a legal advocate. Go fuck yourself. And Anthony said in this TikTok recorded last week of me recording this now that she wanted to continue working as a legal advocate. She felt compelled to advocate for herself and for her daughter. What daughter? Yeah. I thought you slept really soundly at night knowing that she was murdered by an unknown person. And that daughter, right? Got it. And she said she believes it's important to use her platform. This way, after people close to her were recently targeted and attacked. What platform? You don't have a platform. The only platform you have is your throne of lies, bitch. I'm sorry, I'm getting really mad. But anyway, she goes on to say, as a proponent for the gapped community, for our legal community, women's rights, I feel that it's important that I use this platform that was thrust upon me and now look at as a blessing as opposed to the curse it has been since 2008, she said. The curse being your daughter who died, who you maybe allegedly murdered, that one. Is that what we're talking about, right? I keep forgetting. We're sweating death, okays. Today is Saturday, March 1st, 2025. This is my first of probably many recordings on a series that I am starting. I am a legal advocate. I am a researcher. I've been in the legal field since 2011. And in this capacity, I feel that it's necessary, if I'm going to continue to operate appropriately as a legal advocate, that I start to advocate for myself and also advocate for my daughter. For those of you who don't know, my name is Kaylee Anthony. My daughter is Caylee Anthony. My parents are George and Cindy Anthony Ann. This is not about them. This is not in response to anything that they have said or done. That's not to say that I'm not going to respond at some point to some of the things that they have said and done. The whole point of this is for me to begin to reintroduce myself. I'm doing this both personally for me, but in a professional capacity moving forward. The majority of what you will see will be me speaking in a professional capacity. My goal is to continue to help give a voice to people, to give people tools and resources that they can utilize so they actually know where they can turn to. So with that, please join me on Substack. If you have questions, I will set up an email address where we can correspond directly. Up until this point, that has never happened, and it's only going to be on a limited basis regarding legal issues, legal matters on. One of the main reasons that I'm doing this, there are people close to me who have been targeted and attacked recently. There are also people close to me who have had some recent things occur, and when necessary, people needed to step up, myself included. So as a proponent for the lapped community, for our legal community, women's rights, I feel that it's important that I use this platform that was thrust upon me and now look at as a blessing as opposed to the curse that it has been since 2008. But that these aren't going to be perfect. They're not going to be edited most of the time. They're not going to be short, but I am proverbial standing in the light, embracing this peace, still going to keep my privacy intact. So you will get very comfortable with my car, and I will explain in great detail why it's so important for people to protect their privacy. It's not just important to public figures, it's even more important to private individuals. And with the current climate in our country especially, it's that much more important, which is why I am utilizing the Substack platform. Yes, I am advertising this, publishing this on TikTok, possibly also through other media platforms, but my intention is to separate from that and showcase, even unshowcase, more why Substack is such an important resource for people to utilize moving forward. Anyway, I appreciate your time, and we'll see how this goes. And then Anthony would go on to say that she has worked in the legal field since 2011, though she did not say exactly to what capacity. And the now defunct news website The Messenger reported in 23 that Anthony was still working for McKenna and had also started a private investigation. Business. Investigate yourself, bitch. And Anthony directed viewers to her Substack, an online platform, and said she plans to set up an email address where people can correspond with her directly on a limited basis regarding legal issues. I'll make sure to email you about this weird case I heard about Caylee Anthony. You know her, she's your dead daughter. You remember her, right? Keep forgetting about that. And she said she still plans to protect her privacy while explaining in great detail why doing so is important for public and private figures. Yeah, that amount of figures. Yeah, that amount of Privacy is only necessary to you because you allegedly killed your daughter and people are really mad about that. So maybe just crawl back into the hole you came from. Unleaved T, IKT, but anyway. She goes on to say, my goal is to continue to help give a voice to people, to give people tools and resources that they can utilize so they actually know where they can turn to. Would have been nice if you gave your daughter that ability, gave her a voice, somewhere to turn to instead of ditching her constantly, unpartying, unleaving her with your mom and then not being able to take care of her and allegedly getting rid of her. Well, people are just as pissed as me. Didn't take very long for me to just get really opinionated, and I'm sorry, I'm not really sorry anyway. People are pissed. Fuck TIKTOK, alright, about this whole thing. A lot of people are pissed. Those of you who don't know, my name is Casey Anthony. As a proponent for the lapped community women's rights, I use this platform that was thrust upon me. Yes, I am on TIKTOK. Who is we exactly? Like, certainly not me. Like, they found her kid's corpse in the back of her arc. I am not apologizing to her. But she also has followers. She has gained a lot of followers, and it's slightly concerning, but maybe it's just people that just want to follow along what the freak she is doing on a platform. I just not a lot of things to say, not a lot of nice things to say, so I'm not gonna say them all. That's what my mom always told me, and my mom got me into this case. I remember when she literally was watching this case and I was watching it with her as a little preteen, and she was just getting fired up. She was getting fired up, and so was I. I was like 12 and I was like, yeah, Mom, what you said. I'm gonna make this my job, and I did in an unprofessional way, but we're still here. But basically, the only positive thing about Casey Anthony is that she has single-handedly brought millions of people together who may not have ever agreed on one thing. And those people agree that Casey Anthony should maybe go back on trial, allegedly, but I'm not saying anything as she's innocent until proven guilty, but right now she's innocent, so I just want to cover my bases there. And don't just say that, yeah, that's where we're at, I'm not about spreading hate or anything like that. I say just ignore her existence. I think all she ever wanted was to be famous, and she got a little piece of that with this whole case, and now she's trying to abuse it by lying again. Cars she does that, she's pathological liar. But yeah, it's all I have to say about that. If you like the video, and if you want to subscribe. This has been, and I will see you in the next one, alright. Goodbye, I love you, goodbye. Your beautiful goodbye. In 2020, a college student named Derek Schubert was scrolling through cold case files when he stumbled upon a story of a 9-year-old girl who had been murdered in 1964. What he discovered would not only change his life, but would finally bring closure to a family that had been waiting 56 years for answers. This is a story of how a 20-year-old genealogy enthusiast accomplished what generations of seasoned investigators couldn't, solving one of Pennsylvania's oldest cold cases. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded. Sounded like a haunted mosquito, didn't it? Anyway, today we are talking about a crazy case that I came across. It is absolutely mind-blowing. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this solve cold case together. Morris and Shivrella entered the world on Thanksgiving Day, November 25th, 1954, in Waterloo, New York. Born to Carmen and Mary Shivrella, she was the second of 5 children who would grow up to embody the tight-knit values of a working-class Italian-American family. Her father, Carmen, originally from Wilkes-Barre, had met her mother, Mary, a Hazleton native, and after spending a few years in New York, the family made the decision to return to Mary's hometown. Hazleton, Pennsylvania, in the early 1960s was a community still deeply rooted in its coal mining heritage. The city sat in the heart of the anthracite region, where generations of families had built their lives around the rhythms of the mines. And though the industry was beginning its decline, the culture still remained, a place where families knew their neighbors, where children walked to school without any sort of fear, and where the Catholic Church served as a backbone of community life. So the Shivrella family settled into the northwest section of Hazleton, where Carmen operated the Little Market, a neighborhood grocery store that sat right next to their home. It was very demanding work, and Carmen would rise early to pick up supplies, tend to customers from 0 a.m. to 0 p.m., 7 days a week, and handle the bookkeeping late into the night. Meanwhile, Mary worked at one of the downtown knitting mills, contributing to the family's income and an economy that was slowly transitioning away from its industrial roots. But despite the long hours that their parents worked, the Shivrella children experienced a childhood rich with love and tradition. Sundays were sacred in their household, as Carmen would close the store for exactly 1 hour around lunchtime, and Mary would prepare a special meal, the only time during the week when the entire family could sit together around the table. So Sunday mornings began at Mass at either St. Joseph's or Most Precious Blood Church, reinforcing the deep Catholic faith that guided their family values. And for little Morris, faith wasn't just a family obligation. It was a calling to her. The little girl with the bright blue eyes and dark hair was known for her gentle soul and caring nature, and she would often tell family that she wanted to become a nun when she grew up, a dream that seemed to fit perfectly with her character. She was the type of child that just put others before herself. She was extremely selfless, and who found joy in just simple pleasures like playing school with her siblings or tinkering on an organ her parents had bought her at Sears. In the evening, Morris would sit at the organ composing songs with her big brother Ron, and their voices just filled the house with music. She would also share a bedroom with her younger sister Carmen Marie, and the two girls would brush each other's hair at night while looking up at the heartthrobs David Cassidy and Ricky Nelson, whose photographs covered their walls. So it was an innocent time when a little girl's biggest concerns were learning to play the organ and helping her family. The family's daily routine was predictable and comforting. Carmen would be at the store before dawn, preparing for another long day of serving their neighbors. Mary would head to the knitting mill, working alongside other women who formed the backbone of Hazelton's changing economy. And the children would walk to St. Joseph's parochial school, where nuns in traditional habits provided education infused with Catholic values. It was a community where everyone knew everyone, where children were safe once again, and where the most shocking news might be about someone's garden not producing tomatoes or the latest church fundraiser. It was a very peaceful community until it wasn't, because beneath this veneer of small-town safety, darkness was lurking. In 1964, the concept of stranger danger barely existed, and children walked alone to school, played outside unsupervised, and parents felt secure in their tight-knit communities. The innocence of that era, which allowed children like Morris to roam freely, would soon be shattered by an act of evil that would change not just one family, but an entire community's understanding of safety. So Wednesday, March 18th, 1964, began like any other day in the Shivrella household. At 4 a.m., the alarm clock shattered the early morning silence, and Morris would roll over in the bed she shared with her sister Carmen Marie, whispering, quote, "Close your eyes, do one," which was her nickname that she gave her little sister. She also said, "I'm going to turn on the light to get my clothes." It was just this small act of consideration that would become one of Carmen Marie's most precious memories. Meanwhile, Morris would carefully select her outfit for the day, a dark jacket and skirt with black leotards under multicolored scarf. She would put on her earrings, slip her silver ring with a small diamond onto her finger, and fasten her yellow gold necklace with this 1-inch cross around her neck. As she prepared to leave for school, Morris had a special mission that morning. As her teacher, one of the nuns at St. Joseph's parochial school, was celebrating a feast day, Morris wanted to honor her with a gift. Again, she's just so selfless and sweet and caring. She would carefully select 2 cans of fruit from her father's grocery store, a gesture that perfectly captured her thoughtful nature. But this act of kindness would change everything, because instead of walking to school with her siblings as she normally did, Morris decided to leave early so she could drop off the canned goods at her classroom before attending daily mass. It was an uncharacteristic decision for a girl who typically enjoyed the company of her brothers and sisters on their 6-block walk to school. So, at approximately 8:00 a.m., Morris stepped out of her family's home and began walking alone down the familiar streets of Hazelton. She told Carmen Marie she loved her as she walked down the steps and turned off the light. Carmen Marie, still sleepy, told her sister she loved her too. But neither girl could have ever imagined these would be their final words to each other. The route to St. Joseph's parochial school was one Morris had walked countless times, 6 blocks through the northwest section of Hazleton, past houses where she knew the families and along the streets where neighbors would wave and say good morning. The early March air was crisp, and she pulled her windbreaker close as she walked, the 2 cans of fruit secured in her school bag. But what would happen next would remain a mystery for nearly 6 decades. 'Cause somewhere along those 6 familiar blocks between her house and the school where she was expected to arrive for daily mass, Morris encountered someone who would change her life and end it forever. So at school, the nuns noticed when Morris didn't arrive for daily mass. It was unlike her to miss such an important part of her day, especially when she specifically mentioned wanting to give her eater the canned goods. So when lunchtime came and went without Morris returning home, her absence became impossible to ignore. Carmen, her father, was at the grocery store serving customers, and her mother Mary was at the knitting mill working, and the other Chevrella children were at school, unaware that their sister was missing. So it was just a normal day at Hazleton with people going about their normal routines, completely unaware that evil had visited their quiet community. So when the school contacted the family about Morris's absence, concern quickly turned to alarm, because this wasn't like Morris. She was responsible, devout, and reliable. She didn't run away or skip school. She was the type of child who followed rules and honored commitments. So the realization that something was terribly wrong began to settle over the family like a dark cloud. Carmen closed the store and began searching around the St. Joseph Church area, desperately hoping to find some sign of his daughter. Police were contacted, and the search would begin through the streets of Hazleton. Neighbors would join in, understanding that when a child goes missing in a small community, everyone becomes part of the effort to bring them home. But as the afternoon wore on and no trace of Morris was found, a terrible truth was about to be discovered. Because a little girl who had left home that morning with such love in her heart and kindness in her intentions would never be coming home again. Because about 2 to 3 miles south of Hazleton, in a section of Hazel Township known as Millville, an entirely different kind of routine was taking place. A man decided to give a 16-year-old nephew driving lessons, choosing the quiet back roads where a nervous teenager could practice without the pressure of heavy traffic. The area they selected was far from picturesque because the landscape was scarred by decades of coal mining, dotted with strip mines that had been abandoned when the coal was exhausted. So these defunct mining pits had become informal dumping grounds where locals would dispose of garbage. So it was essentially just a giant garbage dump. It was just after 1:00 p.m. when the uncle and nephew were making their way along those back roads. The teenager was concentrating on his driving, hands gripping the wheel as he navigated the unfamiliar terrain. But that's when something caught their attention in one of the old strip mining pits. At first glance, it looked like a large doll had been discarded among the refuse. The splash of blue fabric against the dark earth seemed almost innocent, perhaps a child's toy that had been thrown away. But as they looked more closely, the horrible truth became clear. This wasn't a doll at all. The man immediately stopped the car and approached the pit with growing dread. And what he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. Because there, among the garbage and debris that filled the abandoned coal stripping pit, lay the body of a small child. And the child would be a deceased Morris. The scene was horrific. Morris's body was still warm to the touch when they went to check on her, indicating that she had been killed only hours before, if not sooner. She had been bound and gagged and also physically assayed, and the cause of death looked to be that she was asphyxiated with her own shoelaces. You think the more I do these it gets like easier to read down this time. It just really doesn't. It just breaks my fucking heart. And those 2 cans of fruit she had selected so carefully for her eater were found right beside her body, just a heartbreaking reminder of the innocent mission that had led to her death. The discovery was immediately reported to police, who arrived at the scene within minutes. The strip mining pit located in the Millville section of Hazel Township became a crime scene unlike anything the local authorities had ever encountered. This wasn't just a murder. It was an act of unspeakable evil committed against a child whose only crime had been her desire to honor her teacher with a simple gift. Word of the discovery spread quickly through Hazleton. In a community where everyone knew everyone else, news traveled very fast. Carmen Chivrella was still searching around St. Joseph's Church when a passerby, unaware of the devastating news they were delivering, casually mentioned that they'd found, quote, the Chivrella girl dead. I just can't even imagine a mother or a father hearing in a conversation off to the side that their child is gone. It's just all so hard to comprehend. The words would hit Carmen like a physical blow. The father, who had been desperately hoping to find his daughter safe, was now facing every parent's worst nightmare. The little girl who had kissed him goodbye that morning, who had been looking forward to giving her teacher a gift, was never coming home. And back at the knitting mill, Mary Chivrella was experiencing something that could only be described as a mother's intuition. Even before she received the devastating news, she was overcome with a horrible sense of anxiety. Something was wrong, terribly, terribly wrong, and she knew it in her bones before anyone even said anything to her. So the discovery of Morris's body didn't just end one family's agonizing search. It just shattered the innocence of the entire community. Hazleton in 1964 was a place where children could play outside, you could leave your doors unlocked, and where the most serious crimes were minor thefts and domestic disputes. But now, it held the brutal murder of a 9-year-old girl. It was just incomprehensible to everyone around. So as news of the discovery spread throughout the town, parents began calling their children home early from school as the unthinkable had happened. A child had been murdered in their safe, quiet community. The streets that had seemed so familiar and secure just hours before now felt different and dangerous and filled with shadows and possibilities that no one had previously imagined. So the initial investigation was thorough and immediate. Pennsylvania State Police descended on the scene with every available resource, understanding that in cases involving child murder, the first 48 hours are crucial. So they carefully documented the crime scene and collected evidence and began the painstaking process of trying to understand what had happened to Morris. The evidence was both extensive and haunting because the killer had been careless, leaving behind crucial clues that would prove important decades later. DNA evidence was collected from Morris's clothing, and that key evidence was semen stains and pubic hair that were found on Morris's clothing. Just so fucking disgusting and vile. But in 1964, DNA analysis were still decades away from being invented, so these pieces of evidence were carefully preserved without anyone understanding their future significance. The investigation expanded rapidly throughout Hazleton and the surrounding area. The police interviewed hundreds of people, following up on every single lead, every suggestion, and every possibility. They would speak to neighbors, they would speak to teachers, they would speak to store owners, and just anyone who might have seen Morris on her final walk to school, and the community response was overwhelming. Everyone wanted to help find the monster who had killed an innocent child. State Police Corporal Mark Barron would say, quote, "What happened to her ushered in a change in this community. Whether you like it or not, the way you live changed after March 18th of 1964 in Hazleton." For the Chivrella family, the investigation represented both hope and just pure torture, because it was hope that the killer would be found and brought to justice, but torture in having to relive the details of their daughter's murder over and over again. Each interview, each lead, each development forced them to confront the horrible reality of what happened to their little girl. And Carmen and Mary Chivrella handled the tragedy with remarkable strength, though their pain was evident to everyone who knew them. They would cooperate fully with the investigation, providing any information that might help catch their daughter's killer. But they also just had to continue living, which I can't even imagine, just going about your day after something like this happened. But they needed to work and support the rest of their family, because they still had for surviving children to take care of, for children who were struggling to understand why their sister had been taken from them. The investigation revealed several disturbing details about the crime. First, the killer had likely been familiar with the area, knowing about the abandoned strip mining pit where he could dispose of Morris's body. The location suggested someone who understood the local geography, who knew where to go to avoid any sort of detection. So this led investigators to focus on local residents rather than transients or outsiders. But despite months of intensive investigation, leads began to dry up. The Pennsylvania State Police interviewed hundreds of people, followed every possible clue, and pursued every theory. Suspects were developed and questioned, but none proved to be the killer. So, the case that had seemed so promising in the beginning with physical evidence and witness accounts began to go stagnant. The investigation consumed enormous resources, and more than 230 members of the Pennsylvania State Police worked on the case at various times, making it one of the largest investigations in the department's history. Detective Thomas McAndrew, who would work on the case for 26 years, became particularly invested in finding Morris's killer. But despite his dedication and the dedication of countless other investigators, the case remained unsolved. And as months turned into years, the investigation evolved from active case to cold case. But the Pennsylvania State Police never gave up, and the case was reviewed annually with new investigators bringing fresh perspectives to evidence, and new technologies were applied as they became available. And the case file grew thicker with each passing year. But the impact on the community was lasting. Hazleton residents never forgot about Morris Chivrella, or the monster who had killed her. The case became part of the town's identity, a tragic chapter that reminded everyone of the day their community lost its innocence. And parents would continue to worry about their children's safety, and the murder remained a topic of conversation decades later. But sometimes the most difficult cases require unconventional solutions. And in 2020, a completely different kind of investigator would take an interest in the Morris Chivrella case, someone who would approach it from an entirely new angle using techniques that didn't even exist when the crime was committed. So Eric Schubert was just 18 years old when he first learned about the Morris Chivrella case, but he was already developing a reputation as something of a prodigy in the emerging field of genetic genealogy. A history major at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, Schubert had been fascinated by genealogy since childhood, spending countless hours tracing family trees and learning about the complex relationships that connect all of us to our past. I was playing with my Tamagotchi, whereas this guy was literally making history as an early teen. Just extremely impressive. And what made Schubert unusual wasn't just his passion for genealogy. It was his understanding of how modern DNA technology could be combined with traditional genealogy research to solve crime. And by the time he was in college, he had already helped other police agencies crack cold cases using genetic genealogy, a technique that blends DNA testing with family tree research to identify suspects and victims, which is crazy. This guy is insanely impressive at such a young age. So Schubert had spent years developing his skills in what was then a relatively new field, and he was the proprietor of S-Genealogy, his own research business, and had earned a reputation for being able to solve complex genealogy puzzles that stumped most experienced researchers. And in 2020, Schubert was looking for a new case to work on when he came across the story of Morris Chivrella. And the case immediately captured his attention, not just because of the tragic circumstances, but because he recognized that it might be solvable using the genetic genealogy techniques he had been perfecting. Because the case had that physical evidence and also DNA profiles and had been carefully preserved by investigators who understood its importance. It's so rare that we hear about old cases where they actually preserve the evidence. It's just so incredibly lucky and so good on part of the Pennsylvania State Police that they did that. It's just so incredible of them. But Schubert still faced a significant challenge because the Pennsylvania State Police, though very thorough with keeping evidence, were not fans of working with people outside of the police. They weren't fans of working with consultants, especially young college students with no formal law enforcement training, because the idea of allowing a teenager to work on one of their most important cold cases seemed unlikely at best. However, Schubert had something that impressed the investigators, a track record of success. His work on the other cold cases had demonstrated that genetic genealogy could solve cases that had stymied traditional investigators for decades. So when he approached the Pennsylvania State Police about working on the Chivrella case, they were surprised but willing to listen. Again, just 2 thumbs up to the Pennsylvania State Police. So the inevitable decision to work with Schubert represented a significant leap of faith for the Pennsylvania State Police, because they had been working on the case for over 50 years, applying every available technique and resource. So the idea that a college student might succeed where seasoned investigators had failed seemed almost impossible. So they were like, go for it, kid. Why not? Because they were also aware that genetic genealogy was producing remarkable results in other jurisdictions, and they were willing to try anything that might finally solve their oldest cold case. So the partnership between Schubert and the Pennsylvania State Police began in 2020 at a time when the technique of genetic genealogy was still relatively new, like we talked about, but was beginning to produce impressive results across the country, such as the Golden State Killer case in California, which I covered, Dwayne, which is right here if you want to go watch that. It's like multiple killers who were caught decades later. It's a very, very cool video. But the Golden State Killer case just showed that even decade-old cases could be solved by combining DNA evidence with genealogical research. And just for a little refresher, the Golden State Killer basically wanted to figure out like who his great-great-grandma was. And in doing, they got caught as the Golden State Killer. So it's a little freaky, all that stuff, but also clearly awesome for catching horrible criminals. But again, I have a more in-depth video if you want to go look into that. So Schubert's approach to the Chivrella case was methodical and patient, and he began by uploading the DNA profile from the crime scene to public genealogy databases looking for distant relatives of the killer. The process required extraordinary patience and skill, as he had to work backward from distant cousins to identify potential suspects who might have committed the crime. So the work was painstaking and often frustrating because genetic genealogy requires researchers to build extensive family trees, often going back several generations to find common ancestors. And then they must work forward through multiple family lines, identifying all the descendants who might be connected to the DNA evidence. So it's a lot of like what ifs and might tests and all this kind of stuff. It's very, very tedious. It's detective work that requires both scientific precision and genealogical intuition. So for Schubert, the Chivrella case became an obsession, and he would spend countless hours building family trees, analyzing DNA matches, and trying to identify potential suspects. And the work was emotionally demanding as well as intellectually challenging because he was dealing with the most serious crime imaginable, the murder of a child. And he felt the weight of the responsibility to the family and to the community. And Schubert would later explain, quote, "The investigation that went into all this work was probably the hardest genealogy task that I've ever faced," continuing, "This was probably the hardest thing that I've ever done in my entire life, and it means so much to me that I was able to be on the team that could provide answers to the Chivrella family." So the young genealogist's dedication to the case was remarkable, and he would work side by side with the Pennsylvania State Police investigators, combining his expertise in genealogy with their knowledge of the case details. And it was just a collaboration that represented the best of both traditional investigation techniques and cutting-edge forensic science, cause when we work together, we make great things happen. So Schubert worked through the complex family trees, and DNA matches began to narrow down the possibilities. And the process was like solving a massive puzzle, with each piece of information bringing him closer to identifying the killer. And at a certain point, he began to feel confident that he was on the right track, saying, quote, "I knew we were going to find the assailant." So in 2020, after months of careful research, Schubert identified a distant cousin of the perpetrator in the genealogy database. And this was the crucial breakthrough that would eventually lead to solving the case. Because from this distant cousin, Schubert began building an extensive family tree, or building it out more, mapping out all the possible descendants who might be connected to the DNA evidence found at the crime scene. And the investigation kind of became a race against time in a different sense, because many potential suspects were elderly or had already died, making it difficult to collect DNA samples for comparison. So the passage of time that made the case so difficult to solve was also working against the investigators as they tried to verify their findings. But as Schubert's research progressed, one name began to emerge as the most likely suspect, James Paul Forte. Born in 1941, Forte was a bartender and a bar supply salesman who lived in Hazleton his entire life. and he had been 22 years old at the time of Morris's murder and lived just 6 or 7 blocks from the Shivrella family home. And the genealogical evidence was compelling, but it needed to be verified through traditional DNA testing. And there was one significant problem. James Paul Forte had died in 1980, 42 years before the case was solved. He had suffered a heart attack at the age of 38 while working at a bar where he was tied. So the investigators faced a crucial decision. To definitively prove that Forte was the killer, they would need to obtain a DNA sample from his remains. And this would require exhuming his body, a dramatic and expensive step that needed to be justified by the strength of evidence. But the case for exhumation was very strong, and Schubert's genealogical research had identified Forte as the most likely suspect, and traditional investigative techniques had confirmed that he had been in the right place at the right time. And additionally, investigators discovered that Forte had a history of violent sexual behavior that made him a plausible suspect for such crime. Because in 1974, Forte had been arrested on charges of rape and assault, but he had been given a plea deal for the less serious conviction of aggravated assault and was sentenced to 1 year of probation. And in 1978, he was arrested again on charges of reckless endangerment and harassment. So this pattern of behavior suggested someone capable of escalating to much more serious crimes, like taking advantage of unmurdering a child. So the decision to exhume Forte's body was approved in early 2022, nearly 58 years after Morris's murder. And the exhumation took place under carefully controlled conditions, with investigators collecting tissue samples that could be used for DNA analysis. The process was both expensive and emotionally challenging for everyone involved, but it represented the best chance of finally solving this cold case. So the DNA analysis took several weeks to complete, and investigators had to extract usable DNA from tissue samples that were more than 40 years old. Then compared to DNA evidence from that crime scene, which was 58 years previous. So the process required sophisticated forensic techniques and careful analysis to ensure accurate results. So on February 3rd, 2022, the results would come back, and the DNA from James Paul Forte's remains was a perfect match to the DNA evidence from Morris Shivrella's murder. So after nearly 58 years, the case had finally been solved. And this breakthrough just represented a remarkable achievement for both traditional investigative techniques and the cutting-edge forensic science techniques. Because the Pennsylvania State Police had preserved the evidence for decades, ensuring that when the technology became available, the case could be solved. Just an absolute win for police. And Derek Schubert had provided the genealogical expertise that made the identification possible. And the combination of both approaches had finally brought justice to Morris Shivrella and her entire family. So on February 10th, 2022, nearly 58 years after Morris Shivrella's murder, Pennsylvania State Police held a press conference that would finally provide answers to one of the state's oldest cold cases. And the room was packed with current and retired investigators and members of the Shivrella family and members of the media who had followed the case for decades. And State Police Corporal Mark Barron, who had become the lead investigator on the case, stood at the podium with obvious emotion, cause this was a day that many people had thought would never come. And he would say, quote, "Today we can finally say that we know who killed Morris Shivrella. And through the combined efforts of traditional investigation and cutting-edge genetic genealogy, we have identified James Paul Forte as the person responsible for this horrific crime." And the announcement was met with a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the case had finally been solved, but sadness that it had taken so long and that the perpetrator had already died and couldn't be held accountable for his actions. But at least we can hopefully assume he's rotting in hell. And the press conference provided details about James that painted a picture of a man who had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 2 decades after the murder. Born in 1941, James had been a 22-year-old bartender living just blocks away from the Shivrella household when he killed Morris Stold. And he had no known connection to the family, making his selection of Morris appear to be a crime of opportunity rather than a targeted attack. And he also had the history of sexual violence and criminal charges as well, as we spoke about. But perhaps the most disturbing was the realization that Forte had lived in Hazleton for 16 years after murdering Morris, continuing to work as a bartender and interact with community members who had no idea they were dealing with a child killer. And he had attended the same churches, shopped at the same stores, and lived in the same neighborhoods as the family he had devastated. And for the Chivrella family, the announcement brought a complex mix of emotions. And the 4 surviving siblings, Ron, Barry, Carmen Marie, and David, were present at the press conference, representing a family that had waited their entire adult lives for this moment. And Ron would say, quote, that we know the individual, it gives us a sense of closure, and continuing to say, no full closure, we'll never have that, but a sense of closure that we know the individual that did it, and that the individual isn't out committing the same crime and hurting other young girls like Morris. Carmen Marie, Morris's sister, spoke emotionally about the impact of the case on their family, saying, quote, we have so many precious memories of Morris. At the same time, our family will always feel the emptiness and sorrow of her absence. We will continue to ask ourselves what would have been, what could have been, what could have been. But the family's response to the news was remarkable in its lack of hatred or desire for revenge. And their parents, Carmen and Mary Chivrella, had raised their children to focus on love and forgiveness rather than anger and retribution. As even in the face of such tragedy, the family had maintained their faith and their commitment to justice rather than vengeance. And Ron would say, it's never been about the hatred, it's never been about punishment or revenge, only justice. But the responses just demonstrated a remarkable strength of character that honored Morris's memory. And the press conference also highlighted the crucial role that Eric Schubert had played in solving the case. Because the young genealogist, now 20 years old, was recognized for his extraordinary contribution to the investigation. And his work had accomplished what generations of experienced investigators had been unable to achieve, saying, quote, Eric's work was instrumental in solving the case. His expertise in genetic genealogy, combined with his dedication and persistence, made it possible to identify James Paul Forte as the perpetrator. This case could not have been solved without his contributions, which I just think is so incredibly amazing for somebody to just see a case and be so dedicated to it, quite literally getting nothing in return besides the fact that he brought peace to a family injustice. So that is Morris's case and Derek Schubert and everybody involved. Absolutely an incredible job, but an absolutely heartbreaking case. But it's good to know that the family can finally sleep at night, knowing that that absolute waste of oxygen is in hell burning in all sorts of ways. I hope but it doesn't bring back their sister or their daughter, so my heart goes out to the family. And also, I don't mention this much, but part of the proceeds from these videos do go towards victims and their families. So that is extremely important to me. My goal, honestly, with this channel is to be able to give most, if not all of the proceeds to families. And I also would like to make a charity. I'm working on that right now. So I just really want to get back to people because I can't even imagine what people are going through. All I can do is say their stories and keep your curious minds full. So that is the end of the video. Let me know other cases that you want me to go over. I always read the comments. That's where I get all of my ideas for these videos. So I appreciate you. I love you. Stay safe and I'll see you in the next one. Alright, bye.